Welcome everybody. We are going to be talking about shutter speed today. And yesterday we had a little bit of a technical issue and I went on for like 20 minutes about shutter speed, but I'm going to clear it up right away here at the beginning of the video. I just stepped on my dog. Clear this up right at the beginning of the video here. Shutter speed, everybody, not that hard to understand. I know the numbers seem complex on the back of your camera. You'll see them in fractions of a second. Now, shutter speed is in real time. You need to understand that shutter speed is in actual real time because that makes understanding the exposure triangle, 1/3 of it, that much easier once you understand that shutter speed actually means time. So, let's go further into that. When you have a 1 second exposure, when we say 1 second exposure or 5 second exposure, that means that your camera is actually open for that amount of time, okay? So if you are at 3 second exposure, and in fact, let's dial that in, okay? So I've got my camera right here. What I'm gonna do, if you can see it, I switch it to 3 seconds. So listen. My camera was open for that entire duration of time, okay? So when you know that 1 second equals 1 second in shutter speed, then you can really start to wrap your head around what the rest of the numbers in shutter speed actually mean. And I'll just tell you right now, the rest of the numbers in shutter speed are just fractions of a second, and that's what you will usually be shooting at, unless you're doing a long exposure. So I've actually got this long exposure cheat sheet for everybody. If you want this, go ahead and put it in the comments that you want this, and we'll go ahead and make sure you get a link to this, or go to the link that's on my screen at the bottom there, right down there.
Tell them what it does. It literally walks you through it.
We're going to be talking a lot more about long exposures here, but this is a cheat sheet for doing long exposures. If you've ever seen the photographs of cars driving where you see the big long red trail driving by or their car lights driving by, this cheat sheet right here is going to teach you to do just that. So go to that website, you can download it there. But today we're talking about shutter speed, and remember, it's important to remember that shutter speed is in actual real time. So 1 second is 1 second. A half of a second is a half of a second, okay? Now is where it starts to get a little bit confusing for everybody, because remember, in photography, everything is counterintuitive, okay? So what is a faster duration of time? A half second or 1 second? Which amount of time is faster, okay? The faster the amount of time, the less time, right? So if it's faster, there's less time, which means there's less light, okay? So when you have a faster duration of shutter, so now look at my scale here on screen. If you look at the top right-hand corner here, on this right-hand corner, this is the shutter speed scale. And again, just like our other lessons we talked about with ISO and aperture, is each time you jump to each one of these numbers is a single stop of light, okay? And remember, a stop of light is 100% unit of light. That's important to remember because everything in photography is just +1, -1. So you always have to be remembering that. It's a push-pull situation. So if you pull darkness from shutter, aperture, ISO, you need to, if you pull it, you need to push it from somewhere else, okay? So if you take light away from aperture, you need to add it with shutter speed to balance out your exposure. We talked about that before, how there is no better in photography. It's about balance, okay? You have to be able to balance out your exposure meter and figure out what is your desired result, pre-visualize that, and then actually execute on it by balancing out your exposure triangle for the desired result that you want. So going back to shutter speed, it's in real time. All those numbers that you see along here are fractions of a second. So let's talk about those fractions of a second for a moment. Okay, so it's fractions of a second. Now, when you're at if you're at 1/60th of a second, that's kind of like the bar for anything handheld. Now, that is, when I talk about handheld, that is holding your camera with your hand instead of being on a tripod. When you're at 1/60th to 100th, that's an area in which you want to be very steady. Anything slower than that, anything slower than 1/60th of a second, you risk getting the motion shake from your camera. So what's slower than 1/60th of a second? You have to think about fractions, okay? What is a longer duration of time? Because a longer duration of time is going to give you more light because there is more time to allow in more light. So you have to think about it in the time versus amount of light, okay? So when there is more time, there's literally more time for light to be allowed into your camera, which is why they call it a longer shutter speed. So longer shutter speeds are used to allow in more light. That's a good way to think of it. The more time, the more light. So that's a good way to think about it. And just like the rest of the scale, every time you double your shutter speed, so every time you go, let's just say 1/250th of a second. So imagine 1 second broken up into 250 parts. Okay, 1/250th of a second versus 1/500th of a second. Which one is a faster duration of time? 1/500th of a second is faster, it's quicker than 1/250th of a second. So it's actually less time, so it's less light. That's why everybody gets confused with shutter speed, is because, again, they see the bigger number, they think brighter. No. The bigger the number, the darker. And that's why everybody gets confused with shutter speed. So remember, it's in real time. Okay, so it's actual time, fractions of a second. And then it's counterintuitive. So the bigger the number, the darker it is. I don't know why, but everybody starting out in photography seem to think that the bigger, the brighter. So they must think that the brighter, the better, right? It doesn't work like that with photography. It's just a matter of balancing out your exposure triangle for your desired envisioned result. So, shutter speeds. I mean, if you want to think about speed. Okay, so if something's in motion, that should tell you need a faster shutter speed. So let's just take football, for example. Somebody is running on the field kicking the ball around, okay? In order to capture them without them being blurry, because remember, they're in motion. In order to capture them without being blurry, you have to have a faster duration of time. So that means you need to be at like 1/1000th of a second. 1/1000th of 1 second. Okay, so that's really fast. If you have a really fast shutter speed, that doesn't allow a lot of time for light to come into your camera. So if there's not a lot of time for light to come into your camera, that means it's actually a darker exposure. So that's why when you're shooting at fast shutter speeds, you're going to struggle for getting light. I know everybody out there that was shooting for that birds in flight challenge, you probably had noticed the same problem, because when you're photographing a bird in flight, you have to be at a fast shutter speed in order to capture it, unless you're really good at panning. You want to be at a fast shutter speed so you can capture it sharp, but you have to be on a bright day, or you have a really fast lens. We talked the other day about aperture and fast lenses allow you to open up your aperture really wide. So if you open up your aperture really wide, remember, it's your pupil of your eye, that allows in more light, which allows you to shoot at a darker shutter speed. That's starting to make a little bit of sense for everybody. So remember that the faster the shutter speed, the less light. Okay, so faster the shutter speed, less light, the darker the image. Remember, it's a push-pull across the whole triangle. So if you open up your aperture for more light, you can shoot at a faster shutter speed because you now have more light to grab from. Okay, so if you're bringing in more light from your aperture, you now are able to dial your shutter speed. And just so everybody knows, your shutter speed dial here is almost always on your back right thumb, because this is actually what you hear. This is actually what you hear when you take your photo. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and dial in a 1 second shutter speed. So listen. That was the amount of time that my camera took its photo. Listen again. All right, that was a 1 second exposure, and now if I flip it over to, we were talking about 1/1000th of a second. Now you'll see it, the 1000. In fact, do it this way. You'll see the 1000 dialed into my camera. Okay, you see that? You see how I'm changing that number? That's the shutter speed. Okay, when you change that to 1000, I'm literally shooting at 1/1000th of a second. They just don't include the one fraction. Okay, there's too many fractions on the screen for them to be able to put all that information on there. So when I shoot at 1/1000th of a second, look how fast it is. Okay, so I'm shooting extremely fast there, and you can actually even go all the way up to 1/8000th of a second on this camera, which it doesn't sound any different because it's happening so fast. But those shutter curtains are opening and closing at 1/8000th of a second. So your shutter curtain, it's actually a curtain that stops light from coming in to your image sensor. Remember, the first lesson we talked about was image sensor. Okay, that's your ISO. Then we talked about aperture. So your image sensor is in pure darkness at all times. Your aperture allows light to come in, and your shutter curtain is what stops that light coming from your aperture to hit your ISO. So your shutter is really the control all of your camera. Your shutter curtain is what actually captures your photograph. That's another thing that's important to remember. That everything else is just, one's allowing light in, the other one's capturing it, and one is blocking that light. So as soon as that shutter curtain opens and closes, it allows that blocked light to come into your camera and expose your image sensor to create your image. And that's why we call it exposure, is because it exposes your image sensor to light. Okay, so always remember that photography is all about light. It's all about capturing light. You know, there's that common misconception that photography is about capturing a moment in time. You're not capturing a moment in time. You're capturing light in time. Okay, so you have to learn to perceive light. All right, so we take vision for granted. All right, so we take vision for granted, and we don't see the light in its truest form because our aperture, the pupil of our eyes, are constantly constricting and dilating on their own by themselves, by our brain. Okay, the amount of light that's coming from any given source at any given time, humans' pupils are always changing. Now we're going back over to aperture, but we're going to just do that anyway. Your eyes are constantly changing so that your aperture is always changing for your pupils of your eyes. In photography, you've got to do it yourself. So when you do it yourself, you've got to pay attention to what aperture you're at all times. You have to learn to perceive light differently. Now that takes time. It takes time and experience, but there's ways of fast-tracking your perception of light, okay? One of the ways is getting out there and doing trial and error and making a ton of mistakes and eventually learning. And another way of doing that is actually getting a mentor or buying a photography course that helps you learn. Because this triangle, this is just the beginning of it, everybody. This is just the beginning of it. It seems daunting at first, but once you've got this mastered, everything else seems to come rather easy. And so it actually comes so easy that it's almost frustrating when you're talking to non-photographers because they don't see light the same way as an experienced professional photographer would, okay? We're going to be talking about long exposures next. And if you don't know what a long exposure is, it's where your duration of your shutter speed is really dragged out really long. So like 5 seconds or 10 seconds. That means your camera is actually open for 10 seconds. I've got this cheat sheet. It's a, 7-step walkthrough of how to get a long exposure. That is those light trails that you see in those pictures. You can go out and create this with this cheat sheet. You just got to go to the website, download this resource, and do long exposures. If you've got, you need a tripod or something that you can balance your camera on, or you can play with it handheld, but you're going to get blurry trails and stuff like that. Anyway, so the exposure of triangle, they have it as a triangle because one stop equals one stop. So one stop of light from ISO is the same amount of light as one stop from aperture, okay? And one stop from aperture is the same amount of light as one stop from shutter speed. So they're all talking about the same thing. They're all talking about the same amount of light, okay? It's just represented in different numbers, and the science behind it is concrete. So you do have to understand the science behind it, but understanding the numbers is kind of what gets you over the hurdle of understanding the science behind it. Because the numbers are super overwhelming because none of them make sense. And when you're first starting out in photography, they don't make any sense. It doesn't seem to have any rhyme or reason to it until you have someone like me to actually explain to you what they actually mean. Shutter speed is in real time. Once you understand that, that takes out one piece of the three-part equation, and it becomes that much more simple. And shutter speed seems to be the most complex to understand number on the back of your camera for beginners starting out anyway, okay? So when you realize that it's in real time, it just takes that, the confusion out of it. And the rest of it, honestly, aperture is probably the most confusing for, once you understand shutter speed. Once you know shutter speed's in real time, then you try to what's aperture all about? But you got to remember that you're responding to light, okay? You're not light itself. You're out in space, and you're actually capturing that light that's traveling through space. That's what I mean when you talk about perceiving light. Light is always reflecting. When you look directly at a light source, it's really bright, right? So whatever light you're seeing right now, if you're seeing me, you're actually seeing light that's being reflected off of me, okay? From my studio lights here, from all the lights that I have in the room here, from the window light over here, I'm being lit from all directions. But I'm being, it's reflecting. You know what I'm saying? So you have to know that light is reflective and that it's bouncing off of everything in all directions. So then you can start to perceive light in different directions, which is a little bit of a curse. when you start to realize how to perceive light, humans' eyes go directly to highlights, okay? that's what you focus on, and your eyes are based on contrast. So when you focus with your eyes or you focus with your lens, it's picking up on contrast. Now that's what everybody does automatically. They just do it. Okay? That's just how you're born, and that's how you're wired. When you become an expert photographer, when you become a professional, I should say an advanced photographer, you start to perceive light differently, and you stop actually focusing on the highlights, and you actually kind of becomes inverted. Okay, you start noticing shadows before you notice highlights, and that's why you become a great photographer, because now you're thinking in dimensionality with one lens instead of two. So you have to be thinking about depth and dimensionality. Do that with highlights and shadows. So the exposure triangle, I mean, that's just the start of it, but just know it's the big start of it. Okay, it's not like I say the exposure triangle is the start of it, and so it seems so daunting that you don't want to learn it. When you learn this, everything else is like, whoa, how didn't I understand that in the past? Okay, that's the one thing to really understand, that understanding photography is all about understanding this. Okay? It's all about understanding your camera. And this exposure triangle is what the camera is. All these other buttons, it's just to aid you in your exposure triangle. Okay. Once you understand, there's more to photography than just this. Okay, there's a lot more to photography than just this. But mastering this, it only takes a few months with the proper direction. Okay, if you can master this, you can start your business really fast. Okay, I know people that run successful portrait businesses and they don't even know this, and it's because they're afraid of these numbers. Okay. These numbers aren't that confusing. You spend 2-3 weeks in this group, just ask questions. The other thing, guys, don't be nervous to ask questions in the group, because that's what the group is for, is to teach you all of this, to get you over onto manual mode instead of any of the auto modes that you're using now. I'm not talking about autofocus. You should always be on autofocus with digital cameras, but to get onto manual exposure mode. So you're not using aperture priority, you're not using shutter priority, you're actually just using manual features. So anyway, long exposures, guys, let's talk about that next. When you're doing long exposures, you want to have a really steady surface. So imagine your camera's open for 5 seconds. Okay, so your camera's got to be on a tripod. Anything that's in motion is going to be blurry. Now you can use that to your effect. If you've seen me do the light painting before, I've done the light painting before. Again, camera's right on the tripod. Same steps as this, actually. Same steps as this right here. This is what you're going to want. Same steps as this. Set your camera up just like this, that this guide says. Go to this website here. Download this. And you can actually paint light into your camera. Okay, you just use a light source, and you can do it this way. We have a video that we made of me painting light into my camera with my flashlight on my phone, and it worked really well. If I had it here, I would show you. I don't think I have it readily available. But anyway, you can paint light that way. Anything that's in motion with a long shutter speed is going to be blurry. That includes yourself, okay? Now, you can get creative with long shutter speeds. You can get creative with long shutter speeds by not only doing blurs, by actually panning. So, kind of 3 different blurs we're talking about right now. There's a type of blur where your subject's in motion. So say I'm moving during a long shutter speed or something like that. I will be blurry, okay? You've seen that ghost-like effect, okay? Now, the other part is now, say my my camera's actually in motion. That would be the second type of blur. The other type of blur would be is if your lens is in motion. So that is if you're actually zooming. That is if you're actually taking your photo and you're zooming in and out at the same time. Now you can actually get a zoom blur too, which a lot of people overlook that. So with the exposure triangle, everybody, it's all about push-pull. You know, if you pull light from one area, you got to push it from the other. And paying attention to this exposure triangle, paying attention to where the areas are brighter. And then also remembering that photography is completely counterintuitive. Remember, the brighter isn't better. The darker isn't better. It's about finding that middle ground. Okay, it's about using your exposure meter. Now let me go ahead and show you that. This right here, this bar that has the plus and minus on it, I don't know if you all can see that. All right, this right there, this is your exposure meter. Now you're gonna wanna balance that out to 0, okay? You wanna balance that out to 0, all right? That, we'll talk about that on another live, but the exposure triangle is what you use to balance out the amount of light. And that really just means too bright or too dark. With that said, everybody, we're going to go ahead and wrap that up. We're at about 21 minutes. Hopefully you enjoyed that and cleared up shutter speed for you a little bit. I just want to end that, recap what we talked about. Remember that shutter speed is in real time. It's in actual time. Now, if you're not good with fractions, I recommend to start brushing up on your fractions, because the higher the number, the faster, the less light. And with that, if you want to learn more about portrait photography, just photography in general, I have another 45-minute free class down here at certifiedphototraining.com/register. Go ahead, reserve your seat. It's not on for long. Make sure you take advantage of that. We talk about the exposure triangle. More specifically, we talk a lot about portrait photography. And now I know we have, I think, 14 or 15 entries into the portrait photography challenge. So if you haven't gotten your entries in yet, make sure you go ahead and do that, because we'll do a weekly review. And so if you want your photographs reviewed by me or anybody else, go ahead, get that into your into the challenge there. And we'll see you guys in the group. Thanks.